country with only 2 days' notice. Apparently it came to the attention of the White House, and the White House didn't want anyone checking up on what the Russians were doing here.
The Office of Strategic Services, known during the war as the OSS, was created to carry out clandestine operations against the Axis powers. It was headed by General William Donovan. It is now known that Donovan, instead of screening out members of the Communist Party, actually made contact with party functionary Eugene Dennis and recruited OSS personnel directly from communist ranks. In Yugoslavia, the OSS vigorously supported the communist resistance forces under Joseph Broz Tito and cut off all supplies to the anti-communist forces under Draza Mihailovic. At the end of the war, the Nazis attempted to surrender to General Mihailovic and to the Americans, but the Allied command refused the offer and insisted that the surrender must be made only to Soviet troops, thus ensuring that Yugoslavia would be in communist hands. Back in the United States, when the FBI provided General Donovan with evidence that some of his OSS personnel were members of the Communist Party, he replied, "I know they're communists. That's why I hired them." After the end of World War II, the OSS became the CIA.
Roosevelt issued an order to the Civil Service Commission that investigators were forbidden to ask any questions concerning the communist backgrounds or communist affiliations of any applicant for the federal service.
Otto Otepka, for 36 years, was an internal security specialist for the federal government. In 1953, he became chief security evaluator for the State Department.
This included, of course, people in such key components of the government as the Office of Strategic Services. One of the most ridiculous things I ever heard of as a part of the relaxation of the security procedures then in effect by the Roosevelt administration was an attempt by the president to allow the Soviet Union to have an NKVD office in Washington, D.C., while in reciprocity, the United States would be allowed to have a branch of the OSS in Moscow. Now, when one knowledgeable studies the composition of the OSS from its inception, who would be ahead in that situation? Obviously, the Soviet Union.
Why is that?
Well, because of the OSS, as history has now established, was comprised at the very top in key positions with individuals who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
Many of the early recruits into the American Communist Party felt betrayed by such events as the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939, the Soviet invasion of Finland, and the bloody purges by Stalin. The innocent idealists dropped out of the party, but by this time many of their comrades had become hardened revolutionaries and continued to follow party directives regardless of events. Some of those who left the underground came forward to tell their story, and it is through their testimony that we have learned about those who remained behind. Whittaker Chambers was one of those who broke away. Chambers revealed that for 14 years he had been a dedicated communist and had acted as liaison in Washington for a group of communists who held high-ranking positions in the federal government. Elizabeth Bentley was another one who broke from the party in disillusionment. She had held a position similar to that of Whittaker Chambers and had dealt with many of the same people.
We were getting information from the Army, particularly the Air Corps, from the Treasury, from the State Department, from the OSS, from the CIA.
Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley described the existence of 3 underground groups, or cells. The oldest of these was the Ware Cell, formed by Harold Ware, an official of the Department of Agriculture. The Silvermaster Cell was under the direction of Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, an official of the Farm Security Administration. And the Perlow Cell was headed by Victor Perlow, an official in the Treasury Department. Over 80 persons were identified by name as part of this espionage network. The following is but a brief sampling from that list. Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. first U.S. Director of the International Monetary Fund, author of the Morgenthau Plan for the dismantling of post-war Germany, member of the Advisory Committee of the OSS. Laughlin Curry, Administrative Assistant to President Roosevelt, Specialist on the Far East, Personal Presidential Envoy to China. Harold Glasser, Assistant to Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, U.S. Economic Advisor to Foreign Governments, Advisor to Secretary of State George Marshall, helped determine which countries would receive U.S. economic aid. Major William Ullman, United States Air Force, Materiel and Service Division in the Pentagon, access to restricted military information, document photography specialist for the Silvermaster Cell. Also named were Frank Coe in the Treasury Department, John Apt in the Department of Justice, Nathan Witt in the Department of Agriculture, Robert Miller in the State Department, Henry Collins in the Department of Labor, Sonia Gold in a Congressional Investigative Committee, and in the OSS, Maurice Halperin, Donald Niven, Duncan Lee, Helen Tenney, J. Julius Joseph, and Donald Wheeler. But perhaps the best-known name of all was Alger Hiss.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusations. The other side of this question is the reliability of the allegations before this committee, the undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers.
I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
Alger Hiss began his government career as a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Later was employed in the Department of Agriculture, moved to the State Department, and rose rapidly to the rank of Assistant Secretary of State. Was official advisor to President Roosevelt at Yalta, where major decisions were made affecting the fate of post-war Europe and China. Supervised the writing of the United Nations Charter. Was chairman and acting Secretary General at the founding meeting of the UN. In 1939, was identified as a communist agent by two independent sources, the French Intelligence Service and Whittaker Chambers. The reports were ignored and he was promoted. Again, in 1945, was implicated by the testimony of Elizabeth Bentley. Again, the reports were ignored and he was promoted. Was identified a third time in 1946 by a Soviet defector in Canada, and again he was retained and promoted. Finally,